Geoff, woo! Welcome to the stage. Woo!
All right, thanks so much, Greg. Okay, great. So 4 years ago, one of my best friends from Stanford and I were catching up, and we were talking about this interesting pattern that the smartest friends at Stanford were working on making computers better, making robots better, making machine learning better. And we were in the tech industry ourselves, and we were realizing, that's interesting. But we had this sinking notion that, is that the most fundamental problem? Should we be not making sure that we make humans better? And that intuition led us down this path of creating Human, a company we started 4 years ago, and really exploring the space of biohacking. So what is biohacking? I think I either get two responses. It's either one, like, what the hell are you talking about? What is biohacking? Are you hacking biology? Or it's two, this collage of people perhaps microdosing LSD, playing with smart drugs, doing intermittent fasting, maybe doing some interesting exercises, workouts, breathing routines, meditation. I'd like to, for the purpose of this talk, one, define rigorously what biohacking is, and define it in terms of an engineering approach. Two, once we have that objective function of what we're doing with biohacking, develop strategies to solve this problem. And then three, let's talk about tactics and techniques to execute those strategies. So before defining an objective function of biohacking or an engineering approach to human performance, let's really just think back in the context of where the term even comes from. So I think that biohackers are really the intellectual descendants of the homebrew computing clubs of the 70s and 80s. You had garage hackers who were tinkering with silicon, CPUs, GPUs, tinkering with lines of code, putting that into a silicon medium and producing really interesting outputs. Things like graphical user interfaces, operating systems, computer games, music, etc. Now, that same creative intellectual spirit is happening, what I suggest, in the biohacking community today. That same creativity is applied towards the medium of human biology. So given that context of an engineering approach, we've realized that computing as an industry has moved from computer hackers into very rigorous quantitative careers or notions of software engineering, computer engineering. And that same maturation is going to apply to biohackers. So if we have this notion of engineering, well, what is engineering? It's having an objective function, some quantitative measure that we optimize towards. So really, what the core definition of engineering is that let's define an objective function of human performance, and let's build a system to solve that equation. So let me give you an example of what I mean by that. We all have a notion of what a car is. And over the last 100 years, we've seen the car evolve from a Model T to a Tesla electric car to soon in the future autonomous vehicles. But we all see the car as one evolution of a system. And we can all see that the objective function of that car is defined on simple attributes like safety, speed, energy consumption, right? You can see that the Model T has very low attributes across those dimensions. And as the car is improved, those attributes increase in terms of magnitude. So if we have this quantitative framework, can we apply the same thinking to humans? And I like to suggest that yes, we can apply that same engineering fundamentals to human performance or human utility. And you can really compartmentalize these attributes into two key variables, lifespan and a notion I like to call capacity. So let's dive into this objective function for human performance. Lifespan is fairly easy to understand. It's just a notion of how long one lives, right? If you have more years on this planet, we can do more things with our life. Pretty intuitive. And on the y-axis, we have this notion called capacity. And this is kind of an interesting discussion in and of itself. But the core attributes of what capacity can be measured against is this notion of cognitive performance, how smart we are, how fast we can learn, physical attributes, how strong we are, how much endurance we have, and this interesting notion of a social, cultural, environment variable. One way to think about this is that 10,000 years ago, when we were in the Paleolithic era, physical attributes probably were more valuable than cognitive attributes. And today, in a more intellectual, creative economy, intellectual capacity is probably more valuable than necessarily physical attributes. So it's interesting to think about that our capacity of a human really evolves given the context that human is operating and socializing in. Now, I like to also just tease one step further into, you can't really see this on the screen here, but a little bit more of the attributes of what this objective function looks like. So here we have a notion of infancy. So when we're a newborn, we're useless, we have zero capacity, but we are, trained and nurtured by our parents and this community around us. We gain capacity over time. And then we have this notion called health span. I think that's more and more of a popular concept where lifespan is just like number of years that we live, and this health span is this notion of how much healthy years that we have. And then lastly, we have this notion of morbidity. This is sort of the last 10 years of life when we're in a chronic disease state and essentially we're dying. And an interesting factoid here is that really like most of our healthcare costs are actually spent in this morbid phase of our lifespan. So obviously you can project forward. If you can solve some of the morbidity problems, can this be a more interesting healthcare system? So now that we have this framework of how we think about quantifying human attributes in some way, then the problem really boils down to something fairly simple. The engineering problem for biohacking or engineering human performance is really maximizing the integral or the area under the curve against the function, against lifespan and capacity. Can we maximize this curve? And now I want to, before we talk about strategies and maximize that curve, I want to put a couple of hazard posts out there in terms of strategies that might seem helpful but not actually beneficial, right? So we all have this notion of performance-enhancing drugs, things that might give you a small bump in capacity but are harmful in the long term. That's obviously not something that we want to pursue as a strategy to enhance human performance. And conversely, I don't think a lot of us should make the trade-off of living a lot longer but being in a vegetative state, right? Lowered capacity in physical and cognitive attributes, but we live 1,000 years. That's not really interesting either. So what are good approaches to maximizing this function? We see that there's 3 broad strategies to approach here. First, fairly intuitive. How do we just increase the health span? That seems quite knowledgeable. Can we go from the green curve to the blue curve? That area under the curve is going to be larger. Can we increase the capacity of this function? Meaning, can we increase physical attributes, cognitive attributes of performance? Again, the blue curve has more area under the curve against the green curve. And then lastly, can we decrease morbidity? Again, if so much of our efforts in healthcare resources are applied in the morbid phase of our life, what if we had this future where our capacity stays level as we mature and doesn't decrease until we die, and we sort of instantly die? That would be interesting in terms of increasing the overall capacity of human performance. So this helps define the strategies in which engineers then can go about in creating technologies, techniques to enhance human performance. So let's talk about those techniques. And I like to think about techniques boiled down into 2 broad categories. Again, as an engineer, we need to have outputs or quantitative measures to actually know what we're talking about in terms of capacity in physical or cognitive attributes, right? Like I think we have an intuitive notion that someone may be smarter or have better physical health, but let's get quantitative so we can actually be rigorous in the thinking here. So what's happening already now is that there's a ton of wearables that people are tracking for various biometrics. I, for example, am wearing a smart ring that tracks my heart rate variability. But that's just the start of this trend. You already see, I like this photo. This is me implanting my colleague Paul Ben-Jerry, who runs our e-commerce platform, with a continuous glucose monitor. And blood sugar is one of these important metabolic metrics that helps us understand, why are we having an afternoon crash after a heavy lunch? Why do we feel hangry or frustrated when we when we haven't eaten for a while? Well, blood sugar helps dictate why we feel that. So measuring that is very useful. So we have this notion of wearables, implants, and I really also just see a future that the environment around us is going to be full of smart sensors that picks up all these biometrics that we're just outputting every single day. I think there's an interesting factoid that we're literally excreting out through our urine, our feces, our sweat, like terabytes of information, right? Why aren't we collecting this with smart toilets, sinks? Your bathroom mirror could be using lasers to pick up different signals of your metabolites, for example. Now, inputs. So we have outputs that we can now quantitatively measure human performance. Now let's start thinking about how we manipulate and modulate human performance with inputs. And that's where our company, our organization, really is focusing on. But it's not necessarily just things that we have to buy or eat or consume in terms of compounds. For example, this could be very simple. Exercise, for example, is one of the best interventions that we all should be doing. And it hits all those three strategies. It increases health span, it increases physical capacity, and in some senses, it likely also increases cognitive capacity. And lastly, it's just very preventative in terms of morbidity. It increases our health as we are aging. So exercise is one of these obvious things that we don't really think about from an engineering perspective, but we should be thinking about it. Of course, there's also things that we can consume. Nootropics or smart drugs are the interesting category of inputs that a lot of people in the biohacking community are experimenting with. And that's something that we at Human first initially entered the space thinking about. We were thinking the human brain is really the most important attribute that distinguishes us from animals. Why don't we enhance human or brain performance? And as we were investigating the field of brain performance, we realized that another interesting free intervention was this notion around fasting. It sounds quite counterintuitive that not eating might be helpful in terms of human performance, but the data around fasting for longevity, for cognitive performance is actually quite compelling. And we actually have a really large community of not biohackers, but just people incorporating fasting routines into their lifestyle. And one of the endpoints of fasting that we find really, really exciting is this notion of ketones, which is a natural physiological substrate that is a backup superfuel that our body uses when we are in a starvation state. So if we're well fed, we use fats and carbs for energy. But what happens when we're starved? Well, our body produces what are called ketones. And the thing that's interesting about ketones is that they're 28% more efficient than glucose per unit oxygen. So you get more work done with the same amount of starting metabolic substrate. And that gets us as engineers thinking about, okay, ketones are this natural superfuel that our body produces in a starvation state. How do we manipulate this in a useful way? Can we directly access ketones, not having to go through a starvation period or eat a funky diet? Well, the military actually has been thinking about this problem for a long time. And our partners over at DARPA created a multi-million-dollar program to create consumable ketones as a way to enhance soldier performance in the early 2000s. And we have partnered with the University of Oxford, led by Professor Kieran Clark, and the NIH to look at different consumable compounds that drive ketone metabolism. And this is sort of the cutting edge of sci-fi. The ketone ester that we've been working on actually improves capacity. So in a peer-reviewed published clinical white paper, mouse on ketones were solving mazes 38%. So mice on ketones were 38% faster in solving mazes, and mice were running 32% longer in terms of endurance. And that actually translates to human performance as well. So ketones are a more efficient fuel, and in early 2008, 2012 clinical trials, humans were going further. In a 30-minute time trial for elite cyclists, they were going 400 meters further than placebo. In a British elite rowers humans were going 51 meters further on ketones versus placebo. And there's more and more data showing that the cognitive effects of ketones are also carrying over. So the point of this area is that this is no longer just sci-fi. Like, we can actually clinically show through experimentation with military funding that we can actually improve capacity in terms of physical and cognitive dimensions. And this is something that we're actually the world's first in bringing to market. And we're really excited about starting to bring some of the sci-fi notions of human performance into the real world. So in conclusion here, hopefully the main takeaways from this brief talk was getting a sense of, one, an objective function of how we describe human performance in the engineering approach. That's the preferred definition of biohacking to me. And then two, think about the strategies of how we can accomplish that. Increasing lifespan or health span, increasing capacity, decreasing morbidity. So I'd like to just challenge the crowd here. We're in the heart of Silicon Valley. Some of the smartest people in this room were working on improving click-through rates on ads or making robots more efficient. But perhaps the most important problem that we should be thinking about is, how do we make us humans more efficient? How do we make ourselves better? Can we look like more of the blue curve as opposed to the current green curve? So I'd like for you to join the conversation, join us, find me afterwards, and have a discussion about increasing human performance. Thank you so much.